We now have Alice Meadows, and I won't say ORCID, but rather Orchid.
Excellent. We will answer to any name like PLOS, but we prefer Orchid without the H. Thank you. It's great to be here. I am guessing that most of you are probably already familiar with Orchid. And in fact, I wanted to start by asking how many people in the room have an Orchid ID. It's fantastic. Thank you. How many of you are researchers? So I'm very happy to see this because our vision is a world where everyone who's involved in research or scholarship or innovation in any way, so not just full-time researchers, but those of us like myself and those of you that didn't raise your hand at that point but did raise your hand to say you have an Orchid ID, are contributing to the research process and to scholarship. And for the point of Orchid is really to not just uniquely identify you, but also to connect you with your scholarly outputs, contributions and affiliations, including peer review. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. My conflict of interest is that I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Support at Orchid. We're a membership organisation and I'm using data drawn from some of our members today. So most of you in the room know what Orchid is. For those of you that don't, or if you need a refresher, the Orchid ID is a unique identifier for researchers, and we maintain a registry of those identifiers. We're very much about community building. Like PLOS, we're an open organisation, international open organisation, and we, as much as possible, are, if not requiring, then strongly encouraging our members and other members of the community to use standards when they're using Orchid IDs to make them more usable. And when we talk about connecting researchers with their affiliations and activities, as of a couple of years ago, that includes their peer review activities. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Just a quick refresher again on where we are today. There are over 3.8 million identifiers, over 23 million works connected. The peer review activities is much lower than that. As of July, it was about 150,000 peer review activities. It's gone up a bit since then. The data that I'm presenting is based on data at the end of May, so it's a little bit lower again. So you can see as a percentage both of the number of Orchid registrants and the activities connected to Orchid works. The peer review activities is really very small at the moment, but we're obviously hoping it will grow. We have over 700 members globally and over 550 integrations. There are just 10 peer review integrations, and as you'll see, with just a couple of exceptions, they're mostly very, very small. So I want to start by looking a little bit at Orchid adoption by discipline overall, and this is because I want to then go on to look at adoption of our peer review functionality by discipline and by region. So this data was actually harder to gather than you might think because Orchid doesn't collect demographic information. So we just, we do have fields for country, for example, and you can add subjects in the keywords section, but none of that is mandatory. So some people use it, but the majority don't complete that information. So to get at the information about Orchid adoption by discipline, we had to look at the subset of Orchid registrants who have provided some sort of information in their record that allows us to either know or reasonably safely assume that information about them. So for example, for the discipline information, what we did was we looked at their journal articles connected with their record. We mapped those by discipline using the Web of Science, and then we pulled those into a number of sort of broader disciplines. So you can see that the natural sciences, applied sciences and health sciences make up the vast majority of the registrants using Orchid. So this was a subset of around 1 million or so researchers. I'm sorry for the disappeared tag on the left-hand side, but it's the same as the on the right-hand side, so that's representing arts, humanities, economics and social sciences. And I would say that this is kind of more skewed towards the sciences than the research population overall, but not massively so. There are many fewer researchers working in the social sciences, arts and humanities than there are in the sciences. So we definitely are underrepresented in those areas, but not massively so. In terms of adoption by region, what we had to do here to get this information was to look at people's affiliations and/or where they had included country information. So again, this is a subset of around 1 million or so registrants. And what it shows, and this possibly may be surprising to you, but was less surprising to us, is particularly in terms of the number of ORCID works connected to the location-only dataset, is overwhelmingly European, so well over half of the registrants with works connected to their ORCID records by region are from Europe, and that's because there's been a lot of national requirements of ORCID in Europe. So, for example, in Italy, a couple of years ago, they formed a national consortium in order to support their national research evaluation project, which required all their researchers to get an ORCID ID and to connect to their ORCID ID all their works dating back to 2006 in order for them to be considered for the national evaluation. JISC is doing something a little similar. So that's really why Europe is so very much better represented here. So this is definitely, by region, we definitely are skewed, as you can see. So then talk a little bit about peer review and ORCID records. I don't know how many of you are aware that you can connect peer review activities to ORCID records. So not too many. So this is functionality that's been available for a couple of years, but it's only available in our API 2.0, which was officially launched earlier this year, but was available in beta for people to use before that. And basically what it enables you to do is to, for an organization for which peer review is being done, information about that peer review activity can be connected to the ORCID record. It can't be connected by the individual other than, as we'll see in a minute, if they use Publons, which is actually where the biggest take-up of this functionality has come. But we do have a couple of publishers that are using this functionality quite successfully. This example is one of my own, actually, so I'm quite proud of. It was my first open peer review, and it was for F1000. So when I was invited to do the peer review, I was asked if I wanted to. I was asked to use my ORCID ID, and then asked if I wanted to connect the information about the review back to my ORCID record. I said yes. That's the left-hand side. On the right, I then got a message to say, in my ORCID inbox, to say, right, this activity is now being connected, and at the bottom you can see what that actually looks like. The Publons scenario is a little different, and there are people from Publons here, so if you have any specific questions about their implementation, I'm going to refer them to Andrew or Tom. But basically how that works is Publons is like a sort of intermediary, so people connect their review activities to their Publons record, and then there's an integration between Publons and ORCID that allows that information to flow between the two systems. So this is what the current take-up of peer review functionality is. There are some organisations that are actively developing it, some of whom are here today, including a couple of the manuscript submission systems, the other ones. But the American Geophysical Union, F1000, and Publons, as you'll see, are the most active users of this at the moment, and Publons by a long way. So they represent around 92% of all review activities being connected to ORCID records at the moment. So for the next couple of slides, I've really mostly used Publons as a kind of proxy for take-up of the functionality, because essentially that's what it is. So by region, this is just Publons information. So you can see that broadly the take-up is largely aligned with our analysis of ORCID registrations overall. So a little, excuse me, a little bit more in Europe, which again is probably not unexpected, since that's where works activities have tended to be mostly added to an ORCID record. A little bit less in Asia Pacific, but the pattern is not that dissimilar. Interestingly, there are a total of 100 researchers from a total of 134 countries using Publons to add peer review activity to their records. I should have included a list of the top 10, but I didn't. But I do have that information offline if people are interested. By discipline, I added in the F1000 and AGU information as well, because it was very clear what discipline those came into. So the Publons information was categorized into a more granular range of disciplines, and I collated that according to the criteria that we'd used for the broad disciplines we used for our own analysis. So that's where that comes from. And again, you can see that it's actually even more strongly correlated with how our disciplines map in our own analysis. So that's really fairly spot on. So where do we go from here? I mean, this was a kind of interesting exercise for us to go through. I'm not sure that it showed us anything terribly earth-shatteringly interesting, because what it broadly seems to show is that although peer review activities are only being added by a very small number of researchers at the moment, where they are being added, they're broadly in line with the disciplines and the regions that we already know our registrants are coming from. It does show that there's much higher uptake of ORCID in STEM disciplines than in Europe, but that was something that we kind of knew already. We do hope that the overall adoption of our peer review functionality is going to increase significantly now that our new 2.0 API is out, and certainly ScholarOne and Editorial Manager are both actively working on integrating that, and they collectively represent a large number of journals. So we're expecting that will grow significantly. We'll have perhaps some more interesting data to share in future on that. We certainly plan to do that. We're also conscious that we really need to get better at both clarifying the benefit and actually just letting researchers know that this is an option for them. As you could see in the room, even in this room, a lot of you weren't aware that this functionality was available. One of the things that we particularly hope is that this will spread beyond journals publishers to books publishers and also other types of organisations such as funders, for grant applicants, institutions for people reviewing tenure and promotion, societies and others for conference abstracts and so on. So we think there's a lot of opportunity, but this is very, very small first step, and we'll be continuing to analyse and report back on the adoption. Thank you. I should have said acknowledgements. Some of these people are in this room, and very many thanks, particularly to the Publons people who provided a lot of really useful information.
So let me ask the question, which may be obvious, which is, as someone who does a fair number of reviews, what is the incentive or advantage to me to have these linkages?
So I think there are a couple of incentives. One is that once that's been added to your ORCID record, you can then make it available as you wish to other organisations and individuals, but typically organisations that are interested in that information. So this would, for example, be typically if you have a grant application, you may be asked to include information about what peer reviews you've conducted in the last year, 3 years or whatever. That information is sitting there. You can share it either, you can keep it as a record to yourself so that you can kind of share it manually, but increasingly funders and other organisations are able to pull that information directly from your ORCID record, so it's just sitting there and you can share it with them and you don't have to do anything more, so they can auto-populate their forms with that information.
Yeah, but I guess maybe this is showing that I'm not a millennial, but what level, what is the minimum quantum of activity that one would record on their CV, so to speak? Is it really important to document every review that you've done in your life, or is that just something you do as part of your academic life?
I mean, I'm not sure there's a single answer to that, but certainly it's not uncommon for people to be asked to document at least their more recent peer reviews. And for open peer review, where very often that peer review report is available and has a DOI and is therefore discoverable, I think you would want to, by connecting it with your ORCID ID, it would, even if you weren't using it for the purposes of a grant application or a job application or whatever, you would still be able to make it more discoverable, within the community by connecting with your ORCID record. And you can choose whether you make it publicly available or just share it with trusted organizations and individuals.
Hi, Thais from the University of Campinas, Brazil. It's just a suggestion, as you told, you work together with ScholarOne. But usually when we are submitting from this system, we have to fill again and do another registration every time you are doing for a different journal. Maybe it's not on your accountability, but I mean, as you work together, and ORCID would be to bring this to ease this process. So we do have to fill all the data about ourselves again every time you are submitting to a different journal, even if they use the same system, ScholarOne. even if you link it with your ORCID.
So I believe that Scholar One, I'm not sure whether there's anybody from Scholar One here, but I believe that they're already working on that functionality, and Editorial Manager already has it, so that you can use your ORCID ID as a single sign-on, and then any journal in the Editorial Manager system, you have the same information connected to it. You don't have to keep setting up different records for every journal.
Alice, I'm just wondering if you've had any feedback from researchers who are not scientists that they feel excluded at all. Because increasingly you see in all the new initiatives, people, and the science article, because I did tweet about this at the time, throughout talked about scientists this, but actually ORCID is for all researchers. And I think that has to be something that has to be addressed, and to recognise the diversity there is, so that you don't get people who feel excluded. And I think this probably happens with Publons as well. And I'm increasingly seeing when people are talking about peer review as well, and with all the initiatives that are coming out now, because lots of publishers are doing it, they're referring to scientists. But, you know, peer review is for everybody in scholarly publishing. Can you comment at all on that?
I 110% agree with you, if I'm allowed to say 110% in a room full of people who know about statistics. But yes, absolutely, and it's a challenge for us, because we do try anyway to make the effort to always be inclusive and to make sure that we talk about ORCID as being for everyone, not just for scientists. But I guess because scientists were early adopters, and because the type of publication, you know, ORCID was adopted very early on by manuscript submission systems and publishers who embedded it in their workflows, so it's very likely that people come across ORCID in a publications workflow, and non-scientists tend to publish both less frequently and also in books rather than in journals. So I think in some ways it's sort of become a you know, inevitable, not in a good way, but that's what's happened. We have earlier this year we had a community working group to look at embedding ORCID in books workflows, so we're hoping that will redress some of the balance, and we're also actively involved with the I'm going to get the word wrong, the MLA initiative, the Digital Humanities Initiative, which I'm blanking on the name of it, Humanities Commons Initiative.
I know Martin Eves' initiative, is that one?
No, it's related to the MLA, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the exact name of it, but Laurie Hack, who's our executive director, is on their advisory council now. So we are trying to make bring ORCID to the attention, and we have some real you know, supporters in the humanities and social sciences, but it is a bit of that sort of chicken and egg. And another challenge for us is that although you know, DOIs are very easy to connect with an ORCID record, there are other forms of digital scholarship that humanists in particular, but also other non-scientists use, like video, and not that scientists never use them, but they're more common in some of these non-scientific disciplines, and they don't necessarily have DOIs or other forms of identifier, and that makes it harder to automate the way that information is connected to an ORCID record. So that's partly on us to solve, but it's also partly on the community to solve, I think, because until there's a widely adopted identifier for some of these sorts of outputs, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for us to automatically have that kind of information connected to ORCID records.
And just for interest, did anyone from ORCID write to Science to ask for a correction, because they were doing data analysis, and so the analysis that they present in that paper, that article refer to researchers, they say, but it's not, it's the whole ORCID community. So actually, I personally felt a correction was warranted.
Yeah, no, we didn't, but you're probably right.
Thank you so much.